Hello and welcome to the first Gotham live stream in a while. Right? It's been, what, 2 or 3 weeks? We took a little summer hiatus, but we're back. And we're here to talk about Dante. And we are talking about Dante mainly because well, it's mainly because Will, by the way, Will Colding, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello.
Will came to me and said, you know, we're getting a lot of the same questions about Dante, and you know, they're coming from sound mixers, and you know, I think sound mixers have a lot of questions about, you know, quote unquote, how to Dante, and so we wanted to kind of take all of their questions and wrap them up in one live stream.
All of them. Every single one.
Every single, no, the kind of big ones, the big questions.
Yeah, the basics.
And we figured we'd do it with a combination of showing you an actual setup that's geared towards something typical of production sound mixers, but also geared towards you know, some theory thrown in. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to go over, you can find on Audinate's website, and in fact, a lot of the slides that you see are taken from their level 1 certification presentation. So in any case, you know, let's start out with what is Dante.
Right. So Dante is just a protocol. It's a essentially it is a way of moving data from A to B. The data in this case being specifically digital audio signal. So what we're able to do with it essentially is have one device talk to another device, have this device ask this device for audio, and then it gets sent across.
Right, I think it's very, very important to note that Dante is a networking protocol. It's, here, as Audinate defines it, it's a hardware and software solution that transports precisely timed digital audio between devices using standard IP networking. So that's a mouthful. But what it really means is that Dante is specifically designed for audio, but it is a networking protocol. And I think the first step for sound mixers wrapping their heads around Dante is to think of it as a network protocol first that happens to transport audio.
Yeah, it doesn't use Cat5 as a digital snake like some systems do, like AES-50 standard, which Behringer actually uses for their internal, you know, device to device. It's important to distinguish what Dante does from something like AES. It is digital signal, but what Dante is actually doing is networking devices. So it's really more about computer science than audio directly. It's just custom tailored for the audio world. This is our basic Dante rig setup that we have for you today. We have a Behringer X32 producer. It has a Dante expansion card down here, and we're simply running a mic into it just to test things. We have a Sound Devices 970, which will be receiving the signal of that mic and any mixing we do on the console. And we have 2 Cisco switches, which are interconnecting these two.
And this is an example of a simple setup, but Dante can scale way, way, way beyond.
Right. This is very basic, bare minimum, what you would want, and sort of a centralized was a star formation here. But yeah, how many?
Oh, it's, I mean, 1,000 by 1,000, I think is the theoretical limit.
Yeah, when we do some of the larger shows for like reality, the track counts get very high, and Dante is able to handle a lot of streams from a lot of devices with minimal issue.
Yeah. Now, within this rig, we also have a computer, and the computer runs the Dante controller. The Dante controller talks to the Dante devices within the network, but it's not necessary. It's certainly some devices can automatically set connections, which is what the Dante controller does. But once you set the connections, you can disconnect the computer, and you might never need it again.
Right. It's a nice visual GUI representation of what devices are sending to what other devices. It's a nice little patch bay.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if we look at what a typical setup might be, Jared, if we go to the slide, and this is actually eerily similar to what we have set up here. Yeah, I mean, it's a Dante-enabled mixer that goes into a switch in our case, and we'll talk about the difference in sort of networking architectures in a second. And then, you know, other Dante-enabled devices are also plugged into the switch. But the major thing to bear in mind is, you know, these are sort of networking terms. So I think before we can talk about Dante, you know, per se, let's talk a little bit about, you know, how Dante and networks relate. I pulled some slides from Audinate's presentation. Here, let's take a look at the next thing I want to show you. The first thing is, you know, these devices can be interconnected either through a switch or into each other. And in our case, we want to go, it's preferable to go through a switch. As you can see here, if any of these links break when it's daisy-chained into each other, you know, then all of the devices down the line will no longer get the signal. So if you look on the right-hand side of the slide with a star topology, each device has a direct connection to a central hub or a star. And that's much, much more stable. So do we have a camera on the back of this stuff? Do we have a wide shot? Yeah, there we go. So you can see here, we have our mixer, and if we sort of follow this yellow cable here, it's going into the switch here.
Yes, so we have two switches. We have this set up currently in what's called a redundant configuration, and it is exactly what it sounds like. What it means is each device is sending to each of these switches. There's a primary port on here and a secondary port. The primary, the blue, you can see is going into the top. The secondary, this green one, is going into the bottom. So all this means is if we lose power or the cable goes bad on the top one, the same information is being sent over the secondary. So you have a safety net if something goes wrong with your primary.
And I think it's important to note that you don't need to have a secondary.
It's not required. When we're building Dante-based rigs, we always make it a primary and secondary system, just because obviously we don't want to have any failures for our customers. I think it's the actually least confusing way of structuring it. When you see everything going into a switch rather than having to worry about, oh, I've daisy-chained this to this to this, and if you break one of those connections, which devices are still talking to one another. This way it's all centralized. This way you can see on the front of it that there are flashing lights if there's an actual connection.
Right, so it's two things going on. One is we set it up in a star topology, and the other is we set it up with primary and secondary switches.
Yeah.
And I think that those are best practices. That's, you know, without a doubt, that's the best way to do it.
It's been rock solid.
Rock solid.
All of our major shows that we do.
Right. I think, you know, on a sound cart, if you have limited space, I think you can forego both star topology and secondary. If everything is on your sound card.
I see on the internet a lot of people talking about doing just that sort of thing, but then when they hit issues, they're not sure which thing is. I think it's very clear when you're going through a switch. And for the record, I've never seen a primary switch just outright fail. You know, it's either been something like there's been a bad cable, just a bad Cat5 cable, which is easy and cheap enough to replace pretty quickly. But the secondary is always there to catch it, you know, in our rigs, so it's never been a real problem so far.
Right.
It's really a rock solid system.
All right, so we have our Dante network stream going through a switch, ideally in a star topology, with both primary switch and secondary switch.
Right.
And for the moment, I think it's helpful for everybody if we talk about just primary. We'll just pretend like it's just primary. Because everything we say for the primary is true for the secondary. And when we sort of go through networking protocols, we'll talk about why it's very, very important to keep primary and secondary switches separate. But I think we need to go a little deeper in terms of networking and what's involved in networking stuff. So I'm going to get into a little bit of IP addresses and stuff like that. All right, I assume we have 1 or 2 viewers, and I'll just use this opportunity to say if there's any questions, jump in. If we're going too fast or too slow, or this is not what you expected, I'm sorry, but give us some feedback. All right, so I think let's talk a little bit about what it means for a computer device to be part of a network. And actually, there's a nifty slide which is on here now, which I think there's layers to describing networks. And I've heard this term bandied about, and it took me a while to get into it. But this Audinate slide, I think, is really, really good at sort of explaining it, and it's helpful for us to think about where Dante lies in it. So, bottom layer is like physical cables, hardware, RJ45 jack. There are like those InstaSnakes. That's an example of something that only works on the physical layer, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it's basically balance that work over Cat5. So like multiple channels of audio over balance. That's an example of something that only deals with physical layers. The next level up, layer 2, are sort of hardware devices that don't necessarily have a specific network protocol. Example of that is Aviom, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
Where they're Cat5 jacks and they look like switches and they have lights and stuff and they interconnect the same way, but they don't know from TCP/IP, which is the modern version of what all of our computers know about. And that is the next layer, layer 3. That's where things have IP addresses. That is the protocol.
That's how a computer is connecting to the internet.
Exactly.
That's that component of it.
So I think if we start to think about the fact that Dante is what's called a layer 3 protocol, the first thing that really is important to know is that they need to have individual IP addresses. So when your computer is connected at home, for example, and I think this is what a lot of sound mixers are familiar with when they think about Dante. There's a device called a router, and the router's job is it sits between the internet and it sits between your local network, and it hands out IP addresses. So that's a difference between home networks and office networks and Dante networks. Dante networks should be designed to be standalone, and for the most part, should not touch the internet.
Right.
That's not a requirement, but let's keep it simple and let's not have it touch the internet. And also, by the way, Dante can only go over hardwired.
Right.
You may be familiar with your router also being Wi-Fi enabled, but Dante is not able to go over Wi-Fi, and we can touch upon that a little later. Okay, so we have our devices connected to a switch. It's different from our home network. Even though we've said it's a network protocol because there's no router.
Right.
Standalone. We've said that these devices need IP addresses. So, how do these devices get IP addresses if we don't have a router?
Right. So we're actually using what's called a managed switch. Both of these are the same. These nice Cisco switches. What they do is they provide every device they detect with an automatic IP assignment on this. Basically a virtual network that it's maintaining. So the instant you plug something in, your devices will get IP addresses any Dante devices will be able to instantly see one another, basically. Well, not instantly. There's a slight delay, but you'll be able to see them in Dante controller.
I'm gonna clarify and amplify that. So the manage switch actually it controls the flow of traffic through your network. The IP address is actually, it's built into TCP/IP networking. They call out, and if they don't detect any router or any DHCP server, they'll self-assign an IP address according to a formula. That actually happens with or without a managed switch. Will, you tossed around a term, managed switch. I think we should talk a little bit about what that means. Managed switches are different from unmanaged switches. By about, in this case, about $100, maybe $150 more. Yeah. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to dial in exactly how the protocols are handled in what priority within the Dante network stream. And so managed switches in these configurations are preferable for that reason, because you can really emphasize some protocols within the Dante stream and assign a sort of regular priority to others.
Right. It's not necessarily necessary, but it is optimal for Dante networks, and it's much more scalable than one of those maybe 6-port, Netgears.
Right.
You're going to be able to use this to handle much bigger jobs than something cheaper and unmanaged might be able to.
Right. The other thing that managed switches allow you to do is there's something deadly to all Dante networks in terms of switches, which is green Ethernet. It's a standard. And managed switches allow you to turn that off if they're not off already. And I think that that's worth sort of jumping into a little bit about what's going on within Dante. We said it's digital audio, but one of the things that Dante does very, very well is it keeps the timing very, very consistent. And so, within a networked audio protocol, our typical experience with networked audio is, VoIP stuff. Any gamers do game chat stuff, that's one example. Anybody that uses Vonage, right? And if packets arrive slightly later or earlier than others, you can increase the latency and rearrange the packet order. You may not notice the occasional drop packet. Yeah. But Dante is absolutely not like that. Dante is very, very specific. What goes into the system comes out in the order at a very, very predictable exact latency, very low latency, and we can show some of those screens too. And so the reason that we tend to go with managed switches is because we can say within the Dante stream, we want our network switch to emphasize the timing over the audio. In other words, within the Dante stream, there's a timing protocol, and that is IEEE 1588, I think, is the standard. But in any case, one of the advantages to a managed switch is that you can really dial up that protocol in priority so that everything is sure to get the exact timing that it needs. Right. Having said all of that, this is, even though it's like 32 by 32 ins and outs in terms of networking, this is considered a pretty small Dante network by Dante standards. Yeah. And as long as you chose an Ethernet switch that you were able to turn on and off the green feature, which I think is triple.
Which, to clarify, is about energy consumption. Right. For Dante to operate optimally, you can't be
turning off
power.
The port. Right.
Yeah. You don't want to lose packets that way. That's no good.
Yeah. So you don't necessarily need to go the managed switch, but the Cisco SG300 is it's relatively inexpensive.
Never had a problem with the SG300 series.
We dwelled a lot on this switch, but I think it's important. I think it's actually like an important concept. That's where a lot of errors happen.
It's the more technical, I would say, side of things.
Okay, so everything gets plugged in. They get self-assigned an IP address. Those IP addresses are in the same range. There are certain use case scenarios where you want to assign a switch, assign an IP address, but for the most part, you can just let it self-assign.
Best case scenario, you don't have to touch that at all. For instance, we have this Sound Devices 970 here. If we can cut to this screen. If I go into the menu and I go into the network settings, we actually have auto configuration here. Now it's worth noting there's a separate menu right here, Dante settings and auto IP settings. For those of you who don't know, the Sound Devices 970 and PIX units are able to be remoted into through a browser access called PIXNet. So the IP address here on this screen is what you would use to get to that page. You'd plug that into your Chrome, browser or whatever. However, what Dante is actually doing is if you go into the Dante settings, you can see I have redundancy on, and we actually have two separate IP addresses, one from the primary switch and another on the secondary.
And I think it's also worth noting that, and sorry, I was distracted by slide stuff, but if you haven't mentioned it already, the PIXNet is a separate IP address.
Yes, it is. You see these are, well, you don't have to memorize it necessarily, but you can take our word, 117233. Neither of these match that at all. Completely independent, even though it's on the same connection.
And so we've connected all this stuff together, and there's another step we have to do, right? Just because the devices are connected together doesn't mean audio is going to automatically flow through that. And for that, I think we need to go to, on this computer, the Dante controller. So I think first thing to notice about the Dante controller is that all of the devices that the Dante controller sees become populated in this routing screen here. And it's broken down into Dante sources or transmitters and Dante stream sinkers or receivers. And very often they're the same device. Like this here, the 970, which is our Sound Devices PIX, that can, is a source and is a transmitter and a receiver.
Right. You can route things to it and from it. Some devices are only one way. If they're just output modules or something. Right. There are a million devices now that speak Dante. So
the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the device so that it's something a little bit more, and I'm just showing you what you can do. So I can call it SD970, and this may break the subscriptions.
I don't think this one will.
But
do the other one though. That'll.
Yes. Okay. So now it's something a little bit more human friendly. And while we're in this device config, so here, I'm going to do this from the beginning so everybody can see. We open up in our routing screen. We go to device info. It lists the devices on the network. Here you can see the primary address or the secondary address, and also verify that the link speed is gigabit per second. Which any
right. That's another thing to mention about the switches.
Yeah, should be.
An older switch that's not gigabit might not be optimal for Dante, but most of the ones you're going to be buying anyway are likely to be.
Yeah, in 2017, if you come across a 100 megabit switch, don't buy it. It should be good. All right, and then we can go to we double click on it. We go to device view, device config. This is sort of some of the nitty gritty things that it's important. Yeah. And you're naming the device. You're choosing the sample rate. And you're choosing the latency.
I think that's maybe a little more latency is its whole other topic that I think is a little. It's actually in the second level of certification that they start talking about that.
Needless to say, what I do when I look at these screens is I use these as a guide. Remember when you start daisy chaining things, rather than going through a central hub or like a switch, you are actually increasing the number of switches. So it's even more of a reason to use the star topology like we spoke about, because you can really keep the latency down.
Well, this can even apply for that.
Yep. I think it's worth looking at what it is that we're sort of interacting with. Like, what is a Dante device within these devices? And I stole this from Lectrosonics. They have a product called the Dante Bob. And in the manual, they have this nifty sort of description of what a Dante module does. So the Dante module, they have these funny names that Audinate names them. So the Dante module in Electro Bob is a Brooklyn 2 module. I don't know why Brooklyn. They're from Australia, Audinate is. So I'm not sure. Maybe there's a Brooklyn, Australia.
Australia is Brooklyn 2.
But you can see how a device works. So in this case, the Dante Bob is 8 analog in and 8 analog out. So there's our 8 analog in, just sort of going into this black box Brooklyn 2 module. And here are, from the Dante Brooklyn 2 module, it goes to line outs. And the way that Brooklyn 2 module gets its data is through an internal Ethernet switch. This is not the Cisco. This is built into the card. It's very important. And you have your primary interface that would go to your primary switch, or your secondary interface, which would go to your secondary switch. Mm-hmm. When we talk about star topology, that's how that works. And that's referred to in the Dante controller as redundant mode. When we talk about using it in a daisy chain mode, we talk about turning this into just a regular switch. Mm-hmm. So if we flip over to our Dante controller and we go to network config, that's where you can set those values. And I think one very, very confusing thing that comes up a lot for our customers is you're never sure how this comes from the factory, in my experience. Some of them come in redundant mode, and some of them come in switched mode. And so if you are using redundant configurations, but it comes in switched mode, you are now crossing the primary and secondary streams, and so now all of the IP addresses are flooding the network. Both streams are flooding all the networks, and your whole network shuts down. So once you choose whether you're going switched mode or redundant, keep it consistent across the whole network.
Right, yeah. You will just stop getting audio suddenly. Maybe you'll see noise, digital noise.
Yeah, it's really crazy.
So it's not good.
But the point is, think about this stuff ahead of time. Okay, and while we're in this screen and we've talked about redundant mode, this is where you can obtain an IP address where it self-assigns an IP address, or you can assign IP addresses manually. And there's really...
I've never had to manually.
Yeah, I mean, there's very few use case scenarios, certainly on a sound card, where I can think you'd want to manually assign an IP address. Maybe faster boot up times, but even then, not appreciated. Yeah. And you can also reboot your Dante module, not your device. This Dante controller is talking to the Dante module inside the device. So that's really, really an important thing to think about. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We have a little bit more to go, I think. But I want to take this moment. Any questions? Any complaints? All right, just keep going. Is there a way to clear out all these subscriptions real quick?
Sure, if you just...
Oh, unsubscribe, yeah. Nice. All right, because I kind of want to start from scratch, because when you first get to this...
I'm going to factory default these, I think.
Really?
It's probably going to play havoc. It's bold, but I think we can do it.
All right.
Maybe.
All right. All right, well, Will is playing with fire. I'm going to talk about the concepts of what we're going to do. it's a networking protocol. It has intelligence, but not necessarily artificial intelligence, meaning just because I've hooked up a recorder and a mixer doesn't mean they automatically know that the audio from one should go to the other. And so when you first are excited and you get your Dante network and you hook everything up, no audio is going to show up anywhere. And so that's when you're going to go to your Dante controller. And yeah, I mean, right now, I only see one device.
Right. I've slashed it all.
Because, yeah, Will has slashed and burned everything.
Right. So I think showing just initial setup.
Yep.
So one thing in the initial setup that's worth talking about is when we are adding devices to the network, we have to think about clocking.
Yes.
Clocking is a concept that comes in when we're dealing with digital audio between multiple devices. You want them to essentially sample that audio at the exact same moment across the entire network. Dante has its own internal sync that's carried between the module, in this, the module inside the expansion card on the Behringer here. So we have to do things with those devices to point the device sync to that module. Specifically on this X32, I don't know if it's easy to see on X32 edit
let's see.
actually. It used to be that X32 edit was literally the screen, but now I'm not entirely sure where it's gone. It's got to be in setup.
There we go. Yep, you're there. You're there. Synchronization.
Sync.
Yeah, right there.
There we are. Okay. So what we want to do in this case, I typically like to make Dante requires one device be the master, the sync master, and everything else is slave to it. I typically prefer the sound devices as the master, although the recent firmware update did re-enable the ability to sync this to the network.
Yes.
This one does not have the new firmware, apparently, so I'll fix that after. But so what I'm going to do, if we can just switch back to the, I'm going to enable synchronization on the Behringer to the expansion card.
Now that is a really tricky concept, and I just want to reiterate what's going on, kind of like a 20,000 foot overview of what's going on. I mentioned that Dante is a networking protocol that carries digital audio. There is no sample rate conversion that goes on with Dante. So with digital audio that has no sample rate conversion, there has to be one master. And the way Dante handles that as a protocol is that it elects one of the devices to be the master, and then all of the other devices slave in terms of Dante to that master. But in terms of how each individual device gets its audio and does its sampling, you want it to be able to sync, because it's getting digital audio from the Dante network, you need it to sync to that network as well. Now, each device is a little different in how you go about that, but in this case, it is in that setup screen, and you are saying sync to the expansion card. In other words, it doesn't care that Behringer doesn't care that the expansion card is Dante. I'm just telling it sync to the Dante network because that's where you're getting your digital audio from.
Right. So if we switch back to the PIX view for a second, in the new firmware, in the timecode sync menu, the sync ref option would have a Dante option, but this is not updated, so we don't have that. However, since we're electing this to be the clock master anyway, I'm going to set this to internal. And what we'll do, if we go, I gotta reconnect it. I'm gonna pull this up.
Yep.
I'm gonna take this primary connection, the blue, and plug it into the switch somewhere. There we go.
And pretty soon we should be able to see Sound devices.
Patiently refresh over here. SD970, great.
Uh-oh.
No, it's fine. I unplugged both.
Oh, okay.
Everything's fine.
There we go.
It does sometimes retain just that the X32 producer was recently there, but it'll catch up eventually. So now the sound device is the only thing on the network right now, so it's automatically selected as the preferred. It's elected the master. So now when I plug in the primary of the X32, if I can manage to do that.
Here, I think
upside down.
give you a hand.
He was upside down.
I got it. There. Give it a minute.
Yeah.
It's got to find it. There we go.
Take a second there.
Okay.
Secondary link down. This makes sense because my secondary cable is not currently connected. So the preferred master, I could, if I wanted to internally sync this, I had the update, I could make this the master, I could make this slave to it over Dante. But pretty much all our systems are trusting sound devices with a lot of the sync. Okay. So now we have our devices back. What I'm going to do is I have a microphone right over here. I'm going to just configure in the Behringer, and this is not a Behringer tutorial, so I'm just going to quickly do this to get it up. So I have a mic that is on channel 1 on here, and I'm going to route it out Dante.
Right, and so this is not a Behringer tutorial,
Yes.
but it is worth talking about that. Not only do you have to interconnect the Dante streams, but you also have to tell the individual devices to go through the Dante interface. Sometimes it's automatic, like in the PICs, but in the case of the Behringer, that signal does not automatically show up on the Dante network until you tell it in the device, and then you have to tell the Dante network.
Yeah, and that's Behringer, Yamaha. It's there's the interconnections and the intra connection. You still have to map it. So what I've done is I've custom mapped the first 16 Dante outputs are the physical inputs, the XLRs on the back of this board. I'm going to make 17 and 18 the left and right mix buses here, which again is something that's going to vary by device.
So here, if I look at the bus mixes here, 17 and 18.
Well, no, it's different.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right, anyways.
If we go back to the routing tab, if you want to route from that to the 970, I'll go back to this main screen.
So when I do routing, here's what I think of it. I think of it as going from a transmitter. So I'm going from the Behringer X32, and there everything is pre-labeled.
Well, yeah, it's
right from the
that's
previous
from a show,
job.
but yeah.
And we'll talk about where those labels come from in a second. But everything is labeled, and then I think of it as a receiver. So I'm routing from the X32 to the 970. So here are my 970 inputs, and here is my X32. And you said where do I expect this?
If you put output 1 of the X32, input 1 on the.
So just like that.
Yeah.
Oops, just like that.
Like that. Okay.
And you can see I'm just checking off.
So yeah, if you pause for a second, if we can switch to the PICs camera, if you enable a few more, you'll see these line 5, 6, 7 will be automatically replaced with a Dante subscription. So now those tracks are, yep, there you go. So now you can see the mic that I have running into 1 is running into here. If I were to move this over to input 2, if I can manage it, enable Phantom, bring it up, now it's on the second. So we've just routed it 1 to 1 because Peter has gone 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. If we wanted to throw the left-right mix on there on the first screen, for instance, if we replace 7 and 8 on the PICs with 17 and 18, which are plant 1, plant 2.
17 and 18, plant 1 and plant 2, there we go.
Yeah. So now what I have is, if I bring up this mix, we're actually routing the mix to those. And this is what I do when I'm setting these things up for a customer. I'll route all the ISOs and I'll route a mix, usually stereo mix, so they can have the decision if they're just mono mixing it, or if they want to pan something, that will be reflected in the actual recorded mix.
If I wanted the mix to be track 1, that would just be like this then. 7.
Right.
And then I do all my ISOs after the fact.
This might be clearer if we relabel the outputs on the producer.
And so let's go to device info, let's go to X32, and I can go to my transmits, and here's where I label stuff.
Yeah.
So, that all...
You can also see where there's green, that indicates
audio.
That audio is currently passing through there.
But I can say, these are all right, and then my mix is, what did we say our mix was on the card?
1718.
1718.
Mix left and mix right, respectively.
Yeah. So that's mix left and mix right. Now, just so everybody knows, all of this routing and all of this stuff that we're doing, that's all retained within the Dante module.
Yes.
So if I power everything down, if there's a catastrophic failure, the individual devices still retain that routing and that information.
Yes.
All right. So I think we're getting close to running out of time. Everything all right, Joe?
Yep.
All right.
We do have a question about just kind of the whole setup from a very basic system, how it is all set up, kind of going through each one from the backside and saying what is what and how is it networked.
Okay.
Sure.
So I can come around the table here and kind of unpatch, repatch. So what I have here, I'm going to get rid of this for just a second and explain that in a minute. Mm-hmm. So the back of this Behringer, we have all our analog inputs. We have this expansion card right over here. If I unplug these, this is primary, this is secondary. What I've chosen to do is go in the order on the switch here. We have this red is going into that computer. And that's how we're seeing Dante controller, and we're able to adjust any Dante subscriptions through that. The second port I reserve for, usually I put the recorder, but for the sake of just left to right, I'm putting the Behringer X32 producer, taking the primary, which is gray, and I'll run it in here. Now, it depends on what you do with your managed switch, but suffice to say, it doesn't have to be in any particular order. I do it for organizational purposes, and I tend to label it pretty heavily. The secondary is a yellow Cat5, so I'm going to plug that right here. And again, if you're not even using a redundant configuration, you're not going to be messing with the secondary. You might be using it to switch to a different Dante device. Here's the primary and secondary right here on the 970, and this is the same for the 260i, the 270. My blue is my primary. I'm going to run that in right here, all in a row. Green is my secondary. So the primary and secondary are separate networks, 2 ports on these units, and it's worth noting not every Dante device has the option. Some of the older units in particular do not have a second Cat5 port, so you can't even do
a secondary.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we could do a
depends.
whole live stream on redundancy, but redundant network ports does not redundancy make in terms of the overall goal.
Of course, there's a lot we do, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of just the literal.
That's the physical
what is going into
connection.
what.
Yeah. I mean, it is pretty simple, and it is. The hardest part, I think, is this part is knowing that just because we've connected it doesn't mean we're going to see audio. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably the biggest difference with actual audio devices. Like if it were an analog out,
right,
you would hook it into an analog in and you'd expect to see audio flow. But no, you have to do 2 things: set the device and then set the Dante subscription.
this is crushed, but I'm going to reopen it. The terminology there, the Dante subscription, is worth clarifying a bit. If we look at the Receive tab of this device, the 970, we see all of its subscriptions. Now, what that means is it has, you know, the channel name, which at the time was Plant 1, and then a device name. It's done by device name. It's not looking at any MAC addresses. Oh boy.
We made it mad.
I've angered the Dante gods. It's very specific. If you change the name of this X32 producer, it will break subscriptions that this currently has to it. So it's something, and it will warn you in Dante Controller. Dante Controller is a tool for looking at, you know, your clocking and for making those subscriptions. But you know, once it's all set up, you can power off Dante Controller. Those subscriptions still remain. Even when it goes haywire, there's still audio passing through to the PICs in spite of all of that. And if I kill, well, let me just unplug primaries instead of killing the switch itself. If I kill that, it'll take a second. Actually, it shouldn't take a second. I may have done something wrong.
Wow, we really made it mad.
We really did something.
Well, I think renaming
crossed a stream somewhere.
Yeah, you did. All right, let's. Yeah,
Doesn't look like I have.
You made it mad. Let's see. All right, so this is good. All right, so primary.
Quick troubleshoot.
Primary. Here we go. Primary.
Right, I just unplugged that.
Okay. Top switch is primary.
Yes. It shouldn't. Yeah, it shouldn't display in there, but yeah.
When issues happen, I tend to just in a small network, disconnect everything. Yeah. So top switch is primary, and then secondary is the bottom switch, and then
is the bottom switch on?
Bottom switch is on, and then blue is primary, and green is secondary. And we're hooked in.
Did you change the device name?
I did not change the device name, but hang on one second. So this should go into our computer here.
No, that's actually the network on here that I just used for.
Oh, but in terms of getting the.
It's not necessarily.
Okay, got it. Well, how is the computer hooked in? The computer's hooked in.
Yeah, it was red in the primary.
Got it. Right, and you always hook in the Dante controller into the primary, by the way.
Right, I mean, just think of it as you're doing everything on the primary, and then the secondary is going to be mirrored because the subscriptions, it will send over both of them.
Okay.
That's how it is redundant.
So again, Dante transmitters is the Behringer X32. The receiver is the 970. And
redundancy mode off because I factory reset it. That's why. That was it. That's why you check which mode you're operating in.
There you go.
So now it's going to reallocate its IP addresses and whatnot. Let's actually check while we're in here, the X32.
Producer?
Yeah, checking the last tab, network config.
Yep.
Redundant. Okay. That's me.
So Will, talk through what just happened, because I think this is exactly what we warned against, and it's exactly what happened.
Oh, I'm still not getting you.
All right, well, wait, we'll do that. What did you change?
So when I factory reset it, I forgot that the 970 actually reverts to a switch configuration. So the fact that I had both primary and secondary switches plugged in after I redid it for that close-up demonstration, it crossed those streams and confused the network to no end, and it didn't know what was what. So now we should be fine. Yes, the subscriptions are re-enabled. Now I should be able to safely unplug primary, and it still retains.
You're still getting audio.
Still getting it. It's fine. Primaries are gone. That's how it's supposed to work. That's when you double check and know what you're doing, which I clearly don't.
No, you did fine. And I do think it's worth noting that it's not so much that I'm worried about people unplugging stuff by mistake that they shouldn't be messing with, But I am worried, if you're doing a long run, like in a concert situation, or you have a lot of plant mics, if one cable gets cut, you're not going to lose audio in the middle of a take or a live shot.
Yeah. Or power loss to one of the switches.
All right.
You wouldn't want to knock out 12 devices.
All right. Okay, so wait, now I am...
You don't have it because it's, yeah.
Okay, let's hook this in. There we go. Okay, and I want to just finish up this routing. So Dante transmitters is my Producer X32. Dante receivers is my 970. I want to go. I want to get my mix track going into track 1 and track 2. And yeah, see, it always takes a little while, and then we get our ISOs going to track 3, which are here, and that's a typical production setup, and that's what that might look like. And again, when everything is
it's on 4.
Oops. All right. Well, you get the idea.
Yeah. It's better for the.
Whenever the power is taken away, this stuff is retained, including all of the names. So I can go in and I can name device outputs. Instead of 1, 2, 3, and 4, I can name it character names or whatever. So, all right. I think that's we had a list of stuff we wanted to make sure that we covered. That's it. I think obviously Audinate.com, get the online certification.
Yeah, it is free.
It's free, and it goes through this. It's all good stuff to learn. So, any questions that we got?
No, I think we're good.
Good. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
I want to talk about our seminar. Get Your Freak On. It's a seminar on the upcoming changes to wireless mic spectrum. And we're going to have guests here in the shop in Long Island City, Sunday, September 10th, 12 to 3 p.m. Lectrosonic, Shure, and Zaxcom are confirmed. And you should be here. Our archives are at gothamsound.tv. Follow us on Facebook. Please send your ideas and questions to info@gothamsound.com. Thank you for watching. Thank you guys in the crew. Thank you, Will. See you next time.